Across 17 star systems, few things commanded respect quite like the distinctive crimson ships of the Keth'var hunting guilds. These weren't your garden variety mercenaries or weekend warrior types who picked fights with mining colonies for sport. No. The Keth'var had elevated the art of the hunt to something approaching religious devotion, if religion involved significantly more disintegration weapons and considerably less mercy. Evolution had been remarkably generous to the Keth'var, bestowing upon them everything a species might need to become the galaxy's premier apex predators. Standing nearly 3 meters tall, on digitigrade legs that could propel them at speeds that made cheetahs look arthritic, they possessed sensory organs so advanced they could track a heartbeat from 2 kilometers away. Their natural armor plating could deflect most small arms fire, while retractable claws and serrated teeth suggested that their ancestors had never heard the phrase conflict resolution through dialogue. But perhaps most impressively, they had managed to take these considerable natural gifts and enhance them with technology that bordered on the obscene. Neural implants allowed them to process tactical information faster than most species could blink. Adaptive camouflage systems made them nearly invisible across multiple spectrums, and their weapons, well, their weapons had been designed by beings who clearly believed that overkill was a myth propagated by the weak. The hunting guild's reputation had been centuries in the making, built upon a foundation of successful hunts that read like a catalogue of galactic nightmares. The crystal caves of Zephyr Prime, where they had cornered and eliminated the supposedly unkillable resonance wraiths. The methane swamps of Titan's Grief, where entire pack-hunting species had learned to fear the sound of Keth'var approach songs. The orbital cities of the hegemony worlds, where they had demonstrated that even the most fortified urban environments offered no sanctuary from properly motivated hunters. Each successful hunt added another layer to their legend, another reason for civilized species to whisper their name in the same breath as natural disasters and incurable plagues. The Keth'var had become something more than mere predators. They were a force of nature, as inevitable as entropy and considerably more unpleasant to encounter. Their guild structure reflected this apex status with typical Keth'var efficiency. Novice hunters earned their spurs on relatively mundane prey, escaped criminals, rogue AIs, the occasional politician who had forgotten that campaign promises were merely suggestions. Experienced hunters tackled more challenging quarry, military units, established criminal organizations, species that had the audacity to fight back with some degree of competence. And the elite, the legendary masters of the hunt, reserved themselves for prey that other species had deemed impossible to kill, which brought them to their current situation, drifting in space above a small blue-green world in one of the galaxy's more unfashionable spiral arms. The planet's inhabitants had recently caught the attention of various galactic intelligence services, not for any particular achievement or threat they posed, but for their rather spectacular talent for surviving situations that should have resulted in their extinction several times over. The preliminary reports made for fascinating reading, if one enjoyed that particular brand of cosmic absurdity that seemed to follow certain species around like a persistent odor. These creatures had somehow managed to survive their own weapons development, their industrial revolutions, multiple attempts at self-extinction through environmental destruction, and what appeared to be a concerning tendency to solve problems by hitting them with increasingly larger objects until something gave way. They called themselves humans, though the etymology suggested they possessed the same creative naming conventions that had given the galaxy such memorable appellations as Thing That Eats Starships and the Death World where everything tries to kill you, especially the plants. Intelligence reports indicated they were bipedal, largely hairless, possessed of an average intellect by galactic standards, and demonstrated all the natural predatory instincts of particularly aggressive herbivores. In other words, they appeared to be exactly the sort of prey that had made the Keth'var hunting guilds famous throughout known space. Dangerous enough to be interesting, numerous enough to provide sport, and primitive enough to be caught completely off guard by hunters who had been perfecting their craft since before these humans had discovered fire. The guildmaster who had accepted this particular contract had done so with the same casual confidence that one might display when selecting breakfast from a well-stocked menu. The humans presented what appeared to be a textbook hunting scenario. a species that had achieved basic spaceflight but remained confined to their home system, possessed of rudimentary weapons but lacking any real understanding of galactic standard warfare, and most importantly, completely unaware that they had attracted the attention of beings who considered the phrase endangered species to be more of a challenge than a conservation guideline. The hunting party that had been assembled for this expedition represented something of a compromise between thorough overkill and sporting entertainment. 3 full Keth'var hunting packs, equipped with their finest stealth vessels and most advanced weaponry, accompanied by enough surveillance equipment to monitor every human settlement simultaneously, it was, by any reasonable measure, sufficient force to conquer small star systems, deployed against a species that had yet to establish permanent settlements beyond their own moon. As their ships entered the outer reaches of the human solar system, cloaked and confident, the Keth'var hunters began their final preparations with the methodical precision that had made them the galaxy's most feared predators. They reviewed tactical data, calibrated their equipment, and settled into the familiar rhythm of beings who had never encountered prey that posed any genuine threat to their supremacy. It would be the last time any of them felt quite so confident about anything. The initial surveillance phase proceeded exactly as expected, which should have been the first warning sign for any species that had survived long enough to develop interstellar travel. The humans were busily engaged in their typical activities, constructing things for no apparent reason, arguing about resources they possessed in abundance, and displaying the sort of chaotic social behavior that suggested their evolution had skipped several important lessons about efficient civilization management. From their concealed observation posts, the Keth'var hunters watched with growing bewilderment as humans went about their daily routines. These creatures seemed to possess an almost supernatural ability to turn simple tasks into elaborate productions that defied all logic. They had observed one human spend an entire afternoon attempting to assemble what appeared to be furniture, cursing at inanimate objects with a creativity that would have impressed poets, and somehow managing to create a structure that looked nothing like the provided instructions, yet remained stubbornly functional. The hunters' advanced analytical systems struggled to categorize human behavior patterns. Standard prey species followed predictable routines: feeding, mating, territorial disputes, and the occasional religious ceremony involving the sacrifice of something unfortunate. Humans, however, seem to have replaced traditional survival activities with incomprehensible rituals like weekend projects, social media, and something called recreational shopping that appeared to involve acquiring objects they didn't need with resources they claimed not to have. Perhaps most confusing was their apparent lack of any coherent survival instinct. The Keth'var had documented numerous instances of humans deliberately seeking out dangerous situations for what they termed fun: mountain climbing, deep-sea diving, extreme sports, and something particularly baffling called Florida that seemed to exist solely to test the outer limits of mortal endurance. These weren't desperate acts of creatures fighting for survival. They were voluntary activities undertaken by beings who possessed safer alternatives. The guildmaster, growing impatient with surveillance that raised more questions than answers, decided to initiate first contact using standard hunting protocols. This involved a carefully orchestrated display of superior technology and lethal capability designed to induce the appropriate level of terror and submission in the target species. It was a time-tested approach that had worked flawlessly across dozens of worlds and hundreds of different prey types. The chosen location was a remote human settlement, small enough to be manageable but large enough to provide adequate sport. The Keth'var descended from their concealed positions with textbook precision, their adaptive camouflage systems rendering them nearly invisible as they surrounded the human habitation. Weapons were charged, tactical positions secured, and intimidation displays activated according to protocols refined over centuries of successful hunts. Then they announced their presence with the traditional Hunter's Challenge, a demonstration of overwhelming firepower directed at non-essential structures, followed by demands for immediate surrender delivered in the local language through their universal translators. The formula was simple, elegant, and had never failed to produce the desired response of terror, submission, and pleading for mercy. The humans' reaction was unprecedented in the annals of galactic hunting history. Instead of cowering in appropriate terror, they emerged from their structures with expressions of mild annoyance, and what their translators helpfully identified as extreme irritation. Rather than falling to their knees in surrender, they began shouting questions about insurance coverage, property damage, and something called permits that seemed to be some form of bureaucratic hunting license they expected the Keth'var to possess. One particularly vocal human, apparently the settlement's leader based on the deference others showed to his advanced age and impressive volume, approached the nearest hunter with complete disregard for the massive weapons pointed in his direction. He proceeded to deliver what could only be described as a lecture about proper procedures for alien first contact protocols, citing regulations that didn't exist, and demanding to speak with supervisors who were presumably located several star systems away. The Keth'var hunters found themselves in the unprecedented position of being on the receiving end of a complaint. Their universal translators, designed to facilitate intimidation and terror-inducing communication, struggled to process the flood of human bureaucracy terminology, insurance claims, and what appeared to be threats of legal action for property damage. When the first hunter attempted to restore proper predator-prey dynamics by firing a warning shot, the human's response defied every known law of survival behavior. Instead of fleeing in terror, they began taking photographs. Instead of begging for mercy, they started asking technical questions about the weapons. And instead of accepting their fate as prey, they began arguing about the aliens' apparent violation of several international treaties that prohibited unauthorized military action on sovereign territory. The situation deteriorated rapidly from there. More humans arrived, not fleeing from the obvious danger but drawn to it like moths to a particularly interesting flame. They brought cameras, recording devices, and what appeared to be portable chairs, as if they were settling in to observe some form of entertainment rather than their own potential extinction. The Keth'var hunters, trained for centuries in the art of inspiring terror, found themselves facing an audience that seemed to view their arrival as an inconvenience rather than a mortal threat. Their intimidation displays were met with requests for autographs. Their weapons demonstrations prompted discussions about special effects and production values. Their demands for surrender were countered with offers of coffee and suggestions that they should have called ahead to arrange a proper meeting. Within an hour of first contact, the most feared predators in the galaxy found themselves engaged in what could only be described as a customer service dispute with beings who had somehow managed to turn an invasion into a social gathering. The humans had not only failed to follow established prey behavior patterns, they had apparently decided to treat the entire encounter as an opportunity for cultural exchange, despite the obvious presence of weapons designed to end civilizations. As evening approached and more humans continued to arrive with camping equipment and snacks, the Keth'var hunters began to suspect that their carefully planned assault on human civilization might not be proceeding according to schedule. The turning point came when one particularly enterprising human suggested that the aliens might be more comfortable if they set up a proper meeting area with adequate lighting and refreshment stations. The Keth'var, still operating under the delusion that they were conducting a hunt rather than attending an impromptu cultural festival, agreed to relocate to what they assumed would be a more tactically advantageous position. This proved to be their first strategic error, in what would become a cascade of increasingly spectacular miscalculations. The humans, with the sort of organizational efficiency that had somehow enabled them to build functional civilizations despite their obvious insanity, transformed the suggested meeting area into something resembling a cross between a military operation and a community barbecue. Within hours, they had established perimeters, communication networks, supply lines, and what appeared to be a small media center complete with satellite uplinks and professional broadcasting equipment. The Keth'var hunters, trained to operate in environments where their technological superiority provided overwhelming advantages, found themselves increasingly surrounded by humans who seemed to regard advanced alien technology as merely interesting rather than terrifying. Their stealth systems, designed to provide invisibility against sophisticated detection equipment, proved remarkably ineffective against humans, who located them by following the sounds of confused alien conversations and the occasional frustrated growl. What followed could only be described as the galaxy's first recorded instance of apex predators being managed by their intended prey. The humans, having somehow identified the hunters' command structure through a combination of observation and educated guessing, began directing their suggestions and requests to the appropriate authority figures. They established liaison positions, created communication protocols, and somehow convinced the bemused aliens to participate in what they termed structured dialogue sessions. The Keth'var Guildmaster, a being whose previous diplomatic experience consisted primarily of accepting surrender terms from defeated enemies, found himself engaged in negotiations with humans who treated interspecies first contact as an opportunity for community outreach. They presented him with information packets, cultural exchange proposals, and what appeared to be a preliminary trade agreement that somehow made their invasion seem like a business opportunity rather than an act of conquest. Meanwhile, other humans were conducting what could only be described as reverse reconnaissance. Instead of hiding from the alien predators, they were systematically studying them, documenting their equipment, analyzing their behavioral patterns, and sharing their findings through communication networks that seemed to span their entire planet. The hunters' every move was being observed, recorded, and broadcast to audiences who treated the proceedings as a combination of educational programming and entertainment spectacle. The Keth'var began to realize they were experiencing something that had never appeared in any of their tactical manuals, being managed by creatures who refused to acknowledge that they were supposed to be terrified. The humans had somehow transformed a hunting expedition into a diplomatic mission, and they were treating the galaxy's most feared predators as honored guests who had simply forgotten to make reservations. This psychological disorientation proved to be merely the opening phase of what would become known in Keth'var military circles as the incident that must never be discussed in polite company. The humans' next move demonstrated a level of strategic thinking that suggested their apparent chaos was merely camouflage for minds that operated on principles the Keth'var couldn't begin to comprehend. Instead of attempting to fight or flee, they began systematically neutralizing the hunters' advantages through methods that didn't technically qualify as hostile action. Their adaptive camouflage systems became useless when humans began distributing what they called alien spotting guides that enabled even untrained civilians to identify concealed hunters through behavioral cues and environmental disturbances. Their advanced weapons found themselves repeatedly acting by humans who approached them with innocent questions about technical specifications and somehow managed to activate safety protocols or trigger diagnostic routines that rendered the systems temporarily inoperative. Most disturbingly, their psychological warfare capabilities proved completely ineffective against beings who seemed to interpret intimidation displays as educational demonstrations and responded to threats with requests for clarification about specific terms and conditions. The situation reached its nadir when the humans began what they termed integration assistance. This involved assigning individual humans to work with each hunter, ostensibly to help them navigate local customs and regulations, but effectively resulting in each predator being shadowed by a guide who somehow managed to predict their movements, anticipate their tactical decisions, and consistently position themselves exactly where they would be most disruptive to any potential hunting activities. The Keth'var hunters, accustomed to operating as an unstoppable force of nature, discovered they had become part of what humans cheerfully described as a cultural exchange program. Their every attempt to reassert predatory dominance was met with enthusiastic cooperation that somehow transformed aggressive actions into collaborative activities. When they tried to establish territorial control, humans helped them set up proper boundary markers and offered to coordinate with local authorities about zoning permits. When they attempted intimidation displays, humans provided helpful feedback about lighting and camera angles for better documentation. By the end of the first week, the most feared hunters in the galaxy found themselves following a schedule that had been organized by a human committee, eating meals prepared by human volunteers, and participating in daily briefings about local weather conditions and cultural events. They had somehow been domesticated by a species that had managed to turn an invasion into a humanitarian aid mission. The final indignity came when the humans announced they had prepared a farewell ceremony to honor their alien visitors' contributions to interspecies understanding. The Keth'var, who had arrived as conquerors and somehow been transformed into participants in a cultural exchange program, found themselves being presented with certificates of appreciation and commemorative photographs as their ships prepared to depart, loaded with human gifts and contact information for future visits. The hunters began to comprehend the true horror of what had occurred. They had not been defeated in battle, outmaneuvered by superior technology, or overwhelmed by numerical superiority. They had been managed, organized, and ultimately domesticated by creatures who had treated their arrival as an opportunity for community improvement rather than a threat to their existence. The journey back to Keth'var space proceeded in a silence that spoke volumes about the psychological trauma experienced by beings who had just discovered that their entire worldview was fundamentally flawed. The hunters sat in their command centers, staring at commemorative coffee mugs and handmade thank you cards, trying to process what had become the most successful failure in the history of galactic hunting. Their debriefing sessions resembled group therapy more than military analysis. Seasoned warriors who had faced down the most dangerous predators in known space found themselves unable to articulate exactly what had gone wrong. How do you explain to your superiors that you were defeated by a species that had somehow weaponized hospitality? How do you file a report stating that your hunting expedition had been transformed into a community outreach program by beings who treated interstellar conquest as a logistical challenge requiring proper coordination and adequate refreshments? The Guildmaster, a being whose previous mission reports had read like epic poems of predatory excellence, found himself drafting a document that resembled a customer satisfaction survey more than a tactical assessment. The humans had not only failed to be proper prey, they had somehow managed to turn the hunters into unwilling participants in their own cultural integration program. Word of the incident spread through Keth'var military channels with the sort of speed typically reserved for news of natural disasters or unprecedented calamities. The initial reports were dismissed as impossible, then investigated as potential propaganda, and finally accepted as evidence that the universe possessed a sense of humor that bordered on the malicious. The implications were staggering. If humans could neutralize the galaxy's apex predators through nothing more than aggressive friendliness and superior organizational skills, what did that say about the nature of dominance in the cosmic food chain? The Keth'var had spent centuries building their reputation on the assumption that superior hunting ability translated to absolute supremacy. The humans had demonstrated that this assumption was not merely incorrect, but laughably naive. Other species throughout the galaxy received the news with reactions ranging from disbelief to barely concealed amusement. The crystalline hierarchies, who had been terrorized by Keth'var hunting parties for generations, sent diplomatic congratulations to humanity for their innovative approach to interspecies relations. The hive minds, typically focused on their own collective concerns, took time to express what could only be interpreted as satisfaction at seeing the hunters receive their comeuppance. Most disturbing for the Keth'var was the growing realization that they had been fundamentally misunderstanding the nature of apex predation. They had assumed that the ability to kill efficiently was the ultimate measure of dominance, but the humans had demonstrated something far more terrifying: the ability to neutralize threats without violence, to transform enemies into allies, and to turn invasion into integration. The humans, for their part, seemed genuinely puzzled by the galactic community's fascination with their first contact experience. When contacted by other species seeking to understand their defensive strategies, they responded with the same bewildering mixture of helpfulness and confusion that had so thoroughly defeated the Keth'var hunters. They offered to share their best practices for alien integration and suggested establishing a galactic database of first contact protocols to help prevent future misunderstanding. This response only served to reinforce the growing consensus that humanity represented something unprecedented in galactic evolution, a species that had somehow developed beyond traditional predator-prey relationships into something that could only be described as apex managers. They didn't destroy their enemies. They organized them into more efficient versions of themselves. The long-term consequences of this revelation began to manifest across multiple star systems. Species that had previously cowered before Keth'var hunting parties began requesting human consultation on defensive community organization. Trade routes that had been disrupted by hunter activity resumed operation under human-mediated security agreements. Even the most aggressive military cultures began incorporating human management techniques into their tactical doctrines. The Keth'var found themselves in the unprecedented position of being former apex predators in a galaxy that had suddenly discovered more effective methods of conflict resolution. Their services remained in demand, but increasingly as participants in human-organized, collaborative security initiatives rather than as independent hunting contractors. They had become middle management in a cosmic organizational chart they didn't understand and couldn't escape. The philosophical implications were perhaps even more disturbing than the practical ones. If humans could domesticate apex predators through superior organizational skills, what did that suggest about the nature of intelligence, civilization, and evolutionary development? The galaxy had operated under the assumption that technological advancement and predatory capability were the primary measures of species superiority. Humanity had demonstrated that these assumptions were not merely incorrect, but fundamentally backwards. The most unsettling aspect of the entire situation was the humans' apparent obliviousness to their own revolutionary impact on galactic power structures. They continued to treat their interaction with the Keth'var as a successful example of community outreach, rather than a fundamental redefinition of interspecies relations. They sent follow-up communications asking about the hunters' adjustment to their new roles and offering additional support services for what they termed career transition assistance. As the galaxy slowly adapted to this new reality, the Keth'var hunters found themselves contemplating a future that bore no resemblance to their glorious past. They were still apex predators, technically speaking, but they now operated within organizational frameworks developed by beings who had somehow evolved beyond the need for traditional predatory relationships. The universe, it seemed, had indeed possessed a sense of humor all along. It had simply been waiting for the right moment to reveal the punchline, that the most feared hunters in the galaxy could be completely neutralized by a species that had weaponized customer service and turned conquest into a community improvement project. The ripple effects continued to spread through galactic civilization like a slow-motion shockwave of administrative efficiency. Within months, human management consultants were being requested by star systems facing everything from piracy problems to territorial disputes. Their solution was invariably the same: turn conflict into collaboration through the strategic application of paperwork, scheduled meetings, and what they termed stakeholder engagement initiatives. The galactic military academies began offering courses in human-style conflict resolution, though most instructors admitted they didn't actually understand how it worked. The curriculum seemed to consist entirely of teaching students to respond to aggression with clipboard-wielding bureaucrats and refreshment stations, but somehow it produced results that traditional warfare couldn't match. Perhaps most remarkably, crime rates across multiple sectors began declining as criminals found themselves being recruited into community improvement partnerships by human social workers who refused to acknowledge that certain individuals were supposed to be dangerous. Drug cartels became pharmaceutical distribution cooperatives, smuggling rings transformed into alternative import consultancies, and even the most notorious pirate fleets discovered they had somehow been enrolled in maritime security training programs. The Keth'var, meanwhile, received regular newsletters from their human contacts, complete with updates on local community events and invitations to participate in annual reunion conferences. The hunters who had once struck terror into the hearts of civilizations now found themselves looking forward to these communications with an enthusiasm that disturbed them deeply. In the end, the humans had achieved something that no other species in galactic history had managed. They had made apex predators feel genuinely grateful for the experience of being defeated. And somehow, that was the most terrifying thing of all.